Hi, Kinesiology 4120. Welcome to Program Design Part 1.2. So we've already gone through the basic foundation of our program design life cycle, everything that we need to do from our needs analysis, setting up our goals. And now we're moving into those modifiable variables and how we can organize them. So we went through exercise choice and exercise order in part 1.1. So looking at how we choose our exercise based on movement pattern, not by muscle group, and then how we organize the order of our exercise from most important to least important, from most complex, most muscle groups to least complex, least muscle groups, high load to low load, high velocity, low velocity, most complicated, most skilled, most coordinated, to least skilled, least coordinated, most stable, things of that sort. Now we're going to work our way into looking at frequency. So frequency, when it comes to program design, is looking at how often we train. So how many sessions we have per day, how many sessions we have per week, per month, per year. And this will continue a little bit more when it comes into how we periodize training, because our training frequency per week may change, or training sessions per month may change, or year. It will change throughout the year. And then as an athlete begins to develop more and more, those sessions, we can have more sessions per year, especially more quality sessions. We often don't use more than one session per day, but in some cases there are multiple sessions per day. But it really depends on the goal, depends on the time of the year, depends on the training age of the athlete, it depends on the experience of the athlete. There's so many different variables that come into how we organize the frequency, but it all matters when we're organizing a large macro cycle of training. So when we're looking first at frequency, we need to look at how often we train a muscle group or how often we train a movement pattern. This is the first step in training frequency, because we're looking at movement patterns within a day and movement patterns within a week. This is even smaller than just the sessions. We're breaking it down even further to, so how often I perform a squat pattern, how often I perform a horizontal push pattern, how often I perform a anti-extension trunk pattern, how often I perform a clean weightlifting pattern or a snatch weightlifting pattern, or drop jumps, depth jumps, how often I'm performing these movement patterns. Or if we're looking at it more in a muscle building physique standpoint, how often am I training the pectoralis major? How often am I training the triceps? How often am I training the quadriceps? Because that training frequency does matter. A hint here, we need about 10 to 20 sets of a exercise per muscle group per week for hypertrophy standpoint. So that's a little, as someone trains young or beginners, would be closer to 10, more advanced, closer to 20 sets per muscle group per week is optimal for hypertrophy. So that's a frequency standpoint. But let's get a little bit deeper into this from a athletic development standpoint, designing how often we perform a movement pattern. So first off, okay, this is you're designing your first training session or your first training plan. You say, okay, I'm looking at Monday through Sunday. I've got 7 days a week of training. That's my frequency per week. I have 7 sessions per week, 1 session per day. And I have a real big focus on lower body strength. So I'm going to say squat on Monday. Now, since lower body strength is my goal, it's my primary goal, I might as well squat on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and how about Sunday? Does this look like a conducive approach to developing lower body strength overall? Yeah, let that sink in. We'll get more into this in our lab when we discuss our training frequency, but I want you to think about how often we're training these movement patterns, and think about all of those other movement patterns we also have and need for athletic development. So let's go to week 2. Okay, week 1, I squatted every day. I'm feeling great because heavy squats every day is an enjoyable way to train. If you haven't done it, try it out. Now we're going to go into week 2. Week 2's focus is on upper body strength. I want to build some upper body strength. So I'm going to bench press, okay, because I know I need a horizontal push in there, and I like the bench press, so might as well do it again and again. How about on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and might as well do it on Sunday. Okay, does this look conducive for joint health? Does this look conducive for recovery from training? Think about all of these things. When it comes to our training frequency, it's how often we're training those movement patterns. How about if I maybe change this around and go upper extremity strength, lower extremity, upper, lower, upper, and do that for 2 weeks instead of a full upper body and a full lower body session, or a full week's worth of only upper or only lower. Okay. This seems pretty good. It's a little bit better. I'm able to hit both of those focuses, train it for 2 weeks. That means I'm getting, if over 2 weeks, that means I'm getting 6 lower body sessions, 8 upper body sessions. That's still pretty close to what I was getting with 7 sessions of lower and 7 sessions of upper. It's pretty close. I'm getting a little bit more recovery for my upper and my lower body, but this could be maybe a little bit better if maybe I sequence in a rest interval in there a couple times. So now I'm hitting maybe lower extremity on Monday, upper extremity Tuesday, and then I take a Wednesday off, lower extremity on Thursday, upper extremity on Friday, and then hitting another lower body lift on Saturday, and another rest interval on Sunday. This may be a little bit more conducive to achieving my goals, because now if I do this for 2 weeks, I'm getting 4 upper body sessions, 6 lower body sessions. And what we know about lower extremity sessions, we get a more potent development response from the hormonal systems, from our endocrine system, to gain more muscle and gain more strength. And I'm giving myself adequate recovery between sessions for my lower and my upper body, so I can train even harder on each of those days. So if I have 6 lower extremity sessions in 2 weeks, 4 upper extremity sessions in 2 weeks, I'm able to push even harder in each of those sessions. So have a higher training intensity, training volume, because I've implemented some rest intervals. And I haven't trained those movement patterns as often, so I'm not going to get the same amount of pattern overload and repeated stress on those movements. So I want you to think about this a little bit more, bring those questions to class, of how we can organize our frequency of training based on the movement pattern. All right, so we've touched on these. Now let's go to ones that are a little bit more exciting. These are kind of our organizational standpoint, how we are organizing our sessions within the week, how we're planning those exercises, choosing the right ones. Now we're getting really into the application of the exercise, because remember what we talked about at the beginning. Exercise choice does not determine adaptation. It only determines the location of the adaptation. What really matters is the application and the execution of the exercise. How we program that is through volume and intensity. First of all, what does intensity mean? Okay, intensity does not mean how hard you perceived the workout to be. Okay, I want to set that out. We have an actual meaning for intensity when it comes to resistance training. Intensity isn't how hard, how sweaty, how intense rock out that session was, how tired you are after. No. Intensity is, first of all, our percentage of 1 repetition maximum. That is how we overall determine intensity, especially when we're looking at developing strength. Maximal strength, percentage of 1 RM is our intensity. So if I ask you what's the intensity of that lift and you say it's 85%, that would mean I'm working within that movement pattern at 85% of maximum force production or maximum weight lifted within that movement pattern. That is our true term of intensity. We can also look at intensity as a percentage of maximum effort. So rather than using a percentage of 1 repetition maximum, because maybe you don't have a 1 repetition maximum with that exercise. You may not have a 1 repetition maximum on your incline bench press with a special barbell or with dumbbells. You may not have that already on hand, or maybe you haven't done it in a year. Your 1 repetition maximum changes every day. Okay? It changes based on the training you do, the amount of recovery, what you're eating, your nutrition, so your nutrition status, your hydration status, any stimulants you're using in competitive environments, testing environments. Okay, so 1RM is our gold standard for intensity, but we may use things like percent maximal effort or RPE, rating of perceived exertion, based on repetitions in reserve is a high quality way, and it is very similar to our 1 repetition maximum, but it's a little bit more fluid based on the day. So a 10 out of 10 intensity or 10 out of 10 RPE means that I could do maybe, or I could not do any more repetitions. I could not do any more weight for that number of repetitions, prescribed repetitions at that weight or at that intensity. So that would be a 10. Something like a 9 would be I could do 1 more repetition. Most of the time when we're trying to train for strength, we want to push to a 9 out of 10 RPE on our last set of training, so that we say, okay, if I was training 5 repetitions, I could probably do 1 more repetition, but I probably couldn't do 2. That's really the zone for developing maximal strength, is that 9, which if we think about that 9 or even that 8, I could do maybe 2 repetitions. We're pushing closer to that 85 to 90% of our maximum within that number of repetitions. So those numbers above 7 are really useful for gauging how difficult that effort was without having it to be exactly a prescribed 1 repetition maximum or tested maximum. And if my recommendation most of the time for my athletes is if you say I could do 2 more repetitions, okay, we need to add more weight to the bar, because we're not training near that that threshold. I could do 1 more repetition. We don't always want failure. We want them to be able to complete all of the volume, all of the total repetitions in a major compound lift. But if it happens, we can always back up and kind of restart that progression. So we want to really be training in that 8 and above range for maximal strength. We won't really use this RPE for more endurance or hypertrophy focuses, but for maximal strength, this is a very useful tool along with our 1 repetition maximum. When we're looking at speed, or especially sprinting and movement patterns like that, where we're traveling, locomotion, we can use the percentage of max velocity. If we want to train maximal speed, we'll get into this in the speed and agility section, but we don't want any of our repetitions, if we're training maximum running velocity, as fast as you can move, we don't want to perform sessions slower than 92% of our maximum for that distance, or our best for that distance. If we're not above 92% of max velocity for that distance, we are not training maximal speed. It's not fast enough to give us a speed stimulus, so the intensity isn't high enough. Doing lower intensity sprints do not make you faster. We'll get into that a little bit later, but using that percentage of our max velocity or percentage of your time for that distance, which you can calculate the velocity from that, can be used as a term of intensity for those sprints. So if I want 95% for our sprints, I will take your best time for that distance, maybe it's 20 yards, we'll get 95% of that, and nothing can be slower than that time. And that's how we can gauge those training sessions. Or if we're looking at something like muscular endurance, we can look at maximal repetitions per load. If you're looking for a muscular endurance intensity, you're looking for maximal repetitions per load. This is what we call like muscular endurance or strength endurance. It's a little bit of a flip-flop. So we have a standardized load or standardized intensity, but we're pushing towards maximal repetitions. So it's a little bit different gauge on intensity, but it's for a completely different goal. The goal of repeating submaximal efforts. And then if we can increase those maximal repetitions, we're going to really stimulate that area for that prescribed load. Some occupations may need you to move a prescribed load. So if you're a firefighter and you have to move a hose, that hose is going to be a standard weight. It's not going to get heavier or lighter, but you need to be able to perform more repetitions or stave off fatigue. This may be a way to gauge your ability or your intensity within training at a specific load. So how do we choose the intensity for our exercise? How do we choose it? What do we pick? Do we just pick a random number? Do we always go 10 out of 10 intensity? Intensity is specific to the adaptation. So this is a real key here. Intensity is kind of our keystone with our program design. If the intensity isn't correct, our adaptation will not be correct or correct for our goal. Okay, so let's look at this as our %1 RM number line. We know that %1 repetition maximum is our gold standard for intensity. This is how we gauge it. It may not always be perfect of a number for each individual, but it's a good estimate. If we are trying to develop maximal strength, so the ability to produce maximal force throughout a range of motion, we need to train at 85% of our 1 repetition maximum to greater than 100% of our 1 repetition maximum. I'll get to that in a second. So we're looking at 85% and up, just like I talked about with RPE, an 8.5 and up is where we can do maybe 1 more repetition. We're looking at that goal, or we could do more load, but we couldn't do more repetitions. We're in that range. If we're looking at this from a amount of repetition standpoint, 85% is about a 5 repetition maximum. 90 is closer to a 3 repetition maximum, 95 closer to a 2 repetition maximum. And then we can look at anything above 95%, you're probably only doing it for 1 repetition. You probably can't do 2, but you can do heavier for single repetitions. And then, as you can see here, this maximal strength bar does go a little bit past that 100%. We can train at above our 1 repetition maximum. We can do this through supramaximal eccentric training, where we load up more than your 100% maximum, say on a squat exercise, for example, on a back squat exercise, and you lower that resistance down for a 6 to 8 second period, and then you try to get it up and you have someone help you just enough so that you can re-rack the barbell. That is supramaximal training. Now you have experienced heavier than you've ever done before, which may allow you to train heavier, or in results of your training, get stronger within that exercise. You can also use things like accommodated resistance. So then you're working closer to your maximum throughout the entire range of motion. We'll get into that with some of our methods. That's like bands, chains, things like that. If our goal is hypertrophy or growing muscle mass, our sweet spot range is about 60 to 85%. That's where we can get enough repetitions, but it's not too much. It's not too heavy where we can't get enough volume to stimulate hypertrophy, but it's not too light where it's not challenging. We can develop hypertrophy all the way down to about 30%. Research shows that down all the way closer to 30%, you can still develop hypertrophy. But our sweet spot is really going to be 85% to 60% of our 1 repetition maximum. This is the most efficient, so there's not too many repetitions, while still being heavy enough to have a strength stimulus on top of it. You're going to get bigger and stronger. If you only lift light weights, you can't get maximally strong. So these higher end hypertrophy training does have some transfer over to maximal strength training. And then if we're looking at strength endurance or muscular endurance, needs to be under about 60% and all the way down. But this is submaximal, and we're trying to do this for extended periods of time. So think of this as most conditioning work will likely be in the strength endurance zone. So pulling sleds, pushing sleds for distance, carrying objects, things like that, movement, locomotion, like lunging. I use a lot of the strength endurance zone when I use strength endurance conditioning circuits, where we're trying to stave off fatigue, but not really tax our major metabolic systems. So what about power and speed? Okay, if we're looking for strength speed, so this is the higher end on the force spectrum. Olympic weightlifting movements are the most conducive to train this side of power, and it's going to be 85 to 100% of one repetition maximum within that weightlifting movement. So not of maximal of a squat or a bench press or a row, but of a weightlifting movement in that 85 to 100% zone will help us develop speed or strength speed. So it's high force production and moving as fast as we possibly can with high force production. If we're looking at the other end of the spectrum with speed strength, we need to think more explosive power. More of our focus is on imparting force very quickly and moving an object very, very fast or high velocity. I like to use things like medicine balls and plyometric activities to really zone in on this speed strength end of the spectrum. So this is very light compared to your maximum, but it's a highly focused on how fast you can move that object. What about maximal speed? I talked about sprinting earlier. We have to be faster than 92%. But if we're trying to improve speed, we have to be at 80 to over 100% of maximal movement velocity. Sprinting is a little bit different because of the elastic components and the distances that you're moving. But if we're looking at maximal speed within a movement pattern, we have to move at 80 to 100% or even faster to improve movement speed. We do this a lot with baseball throwing programs using different weights of objects. So a baseball is 5 ounces, and if you throw a baseball that's 5 ounces, that's your maximum speed for that movement. That's 100%. You can use heavier implements to slow down that movement. So now you're moving at maybe 90%, or throwing that object at 90%, or you can use lighter objects, so something that's 4 or 3 ounces, to increase the speed of your arm as you throw the object. So that's going to help you develop a faster movement speed because you're moving faster than you could consciously under normal conditions. We like to use this with assisted jumping, things like that, to allow us to increase the speed of the movement and train the nervous system to move faster than it would beforehand. So here's a nice little guide. So if we're looking for power and we're looking at from the strength speed side, or the big force, little velocity, we can look everywhere from 100%, as long as we're trying to move this, 100 to 50%. As long as we're trying to move this object as fast as we possibly can, it will help us in a strength speed standpoint. Maximal strength is 85% above. Hypertrophy sweet spot is 60 to 85. The strength speed, or the speed strength power, where it's more focused on velocity, is down under 60%. Around 30% is our sweet spot there. And then maximum speed is all the way down on the end. Highest velocity, lowest percent RM, but our goal is to move as fast as possible. So we can't move as fast as possible with heavy loads or heavier objects, so we have to use that bottom end of the spectrum in order to develop speed. So there is no point on this spectrum, even outside the bounds of under 0% and over 100%, that is not available to us to develop a quality training program based on our goal. So we don't always have to stay in this heavy zone. There are benefits to light training. There are benefits to moderate training. There are benefits to every edge of this spectrum. Okay? So now we've gone through our exercise: choice, order, frequency, intensity. Now it's time for volume. Okay, volume is a key component when it comes to our overall training program, and it really is very associated with our intensity. So volume is our number of repetitions per set, per exercise, per muscle group, per day, per week, per month, per year. So volume is how much we do, how many repetitions we do. We have a volume within the set, a volume within that exercise and that movement pattern, a volume within a muscle group, a volume within a day, week, month, year. And the volume, the overall volume, is based on the number of repetitions total, or the number of repetitions times the number of sets they're performed, times the load applied, or the intensity, okay, the weight that we moved, will give us our total volume, or in other terms, tonnage. So how many pounds you moved, or how many kilograms you moved within that session, within that week, within that month, within that year. Okay, how do we choose our volume, or set specific volume? Okay, our volume will be very associated to our intensity, and based on the maximum number of repetitions we can perform with an intensity, or with a prescribed volume, or prescribed load. Sorry. So if we are trying to train for strength, power, and speed, we need to perform 5 or less repetitions per set. So this is a general rule, a general guideline. This limits the amount of fatigue within a set. It allows you to move maximal resistance when training strength. 85% is about a 5 repetition maximum and up. As you have less and less repetitions, you can go heavier and heavier and heavier. And then for power and speed, we are limiting the amount of within set fatigue. So after about 5 repetitions, speed of movement is diminished, power of movement goes down because speed goes down. And so we aren't training that adaptation to the same extent. So we generally prescribe around 5 or less repetitions for strength, power, or speed. With hypertrophy, it's normally somewhere around the 6 to 12 zone, which is about an intensity of 85-ish% all the way down to 70-ish%. So that's kind of our sweet spot for hypertrophy, where it's still on the heavier side or strength side. These are our general recommendations. It's not that you can't get hypertrophy with 5 repetitions. Don't that you just only do 5 and you're like, oh, now I can't grow any muscle. Or I did 6, now I'm starting to grow muscle, I'm not going to get stronger. It's not that way. We looked at that spectrum before. It's just how more of that adaptation will lean in each direction. 5 repetitions, a 5 repetition max is heavier than a 6 repetition max. A 6 repetition max has a more total volume than a 5 repetition max. Volume drives hypertrophy, intensity drives strength. So that's how that really works. And then the more repetitions we do, the more endurance focused it will become. That doesn't mean that 12 or 13, right when I do a 13th repetition, I'm not getting hypertrophy. I can still get hypertrophy all the way down to 30% 1 repetition maximum. But if we're looking for strength endurance, really shooting for that 12-ish up to maybe 20 or 30 repetitions, but that has to be maximum intensity with that load. We're trying to really push the heavier end and repeat efforts. Stave off that fatigue over more and more repetitions for endurance focus. When it comes to the set-based volume, So this is how many sets I would perform. For strength, power, speed, somewhere between 1 to 10 sets. So if you're doing a 1 repetition maximum training where you're trying to push up to a maximum set, maybe you only do 1 set at that heavy weight. Or you're performing speed work and you're doing sets of 2 and you do 10 sets of 2. That's 20 total repetitions for that volume. That's not very high. That's something like a plyometric training session. So about 1 to 10 sets per exercise at a 1 to 5 reps per set prescription for strength, power, or speed. For hypertrophy, we normally shoot for 2 to 5 sets per exercise, and it's really inversed to the amount of repetitions you're performing within that set. So if I'm performing 5 sets of 6, as opposed to, if I perform 2 sets of 6, that's 12 total repetitions. If I perform 5 sets of 6, that's 30 total repetitions. Which one do you think I can train, or that is going to be more conducive to training for hypertrophy? If I know that volume of training, so how much resistance, how much tension over time I can produce within that muscle drives hypertrophy. If I can perform less repetitions in the set, I have to perform more sets to gain the amount of volume necessary to really develop hypertrophy. If I'm performing something like a 15 reps, I can maybe get away with 2 sets of 15 reps, working almost near to failure, and that's still going to give me 30 repetitions. But which one will be heavier? The 6 reps, which means it's going to lean more towards the strength end of the adaptation rather than the just general hypertrophy, less focused on strength, or more endurance hypertrophy. And then for strength endurance, we normally do 3 or more sets, and this can be over large durations, short durations. Endurance is the focus, so less than 3 sets isn't really going to be conducive for endurance, but we need to push those to near failure in all of those endurance bouts, or have a set time period to complete the repetitions. But remember, intensity contributes more to strength, speed, and power adaptations. So if you're doing, maybe you prescribe your athlete 4 sets of 3 repetitions. Okay, that's associated with about 90% of 1 repetition maximum. So they should be pushing it a 9 out of 10. They should feel like they can do maybe a 4th rep, maybe, and they're really pushing the load in that training. That's what they should be doing. If your athlete is performing 4 sets of 3, but the weight is only 60% of their 1 repetition maximum, even though they're doing the right set and rep prescription, that intensity does not correlate with developing strength. They're not going to get stronger. Just because you do the right sets and reps does not make you, or does not mean that you're actually training that adaptation. Intensity is what's necessary. And that means how heavy that resistance is that you're moving within that movement pattern. And volume and intensity have an inverse relationship. The heavier the resistance, the less total repetitions you can perform. You can't perform as many repetitions with 90% as you can with 88, as you can with 85, as you can with 70. Here is a nice little guide provided by Coach Isaac Salazar. He's going to be our guest speaker. If we look at our number of repetitions zone and the percent maximum and the training effect, we can see that 1 to 5, we're looking at really developing strength. If we look at that 6 to 8 zone, we're really looking at developing strength with hypertrophy. So we're kind of teeter-tottering in between those 2 zones. If we're looking at 9 through 12, we're looking at those hypertrophy developments, which may lead to more strength, but it's still less intense compared to a 6 repetition and a 9 repetition max are different. And then if we look into the strength endurance, we're not going to get as much hypertrophy, but we're going to develop more endurance. So this kind of gives you a wide range. This is percent maximum for the number of repetitions. So if I can perform a bench press of 100 pounds or 100 kilos for 1 rep, that means I could do 94 kilos for 2 reps, 90 kilos for 3 reps, and so on down the line. So that is kind of a repetition maximum based on the percent maximum. I hope that makes sense. We can clear that up in class. Okay, so now we've gone through our major points. Now rest. That doesn't mean take a little rest from what we're doing. It means rest, the forgotten variable. Rest leads to recovery. Acute recovery between sets, between even exercises, between even repetitions, between training sessions, between training blocks. Recovery is what allows for adaptation. It is not the training that causes the adaptation. It is the recovery and remodeling from the training that the training stimulated that causes the actual adaptation. So how do we prescribe rest? We need greater than 3 minutes rest for strength, power, and speed movements. 3 minutes to 90 seconds for hypertrophy based on the intensity. The heavier it is, the more repetition or the more rest time. The less intense or the lighter it is, the less rest time you're going to need. And for strength endurance, 1 to 90 seconds. This is going to be really dependent on what type of endurance work you're doing. We'll get more into endurance-based work in our last section of program design. And then when we're looking at training or rest between training sessions, lower extremity training requires more rest compared to upper extremity training. So we want to put around 72 hours between heavy lower extremity training sessions. So between lower extremity 1 and lower extremity 2 for that week, and about 48 hours for upper extremity training. So your upper extremity training 1 and upper extremity training 2 should be 2 days apart. Your lower extremity at least 3 days apart. And more fatiguing training needs more rest compared to low intensity, low volume, low fatiguing training. So really think about that. If you're doing a maximum sprint session, give at least 24 hours, closer to 48. If you're doing something that's low intensity, like kind of tempo runs, lighter conditioning work, you probably don't need more than 24 hours rest. But thinking back to our frequency earlier, our rest will dictate the training frequency per movement pattern, because we know that I can't perform more than 2 heavy lower extremity training sessions per week. I can maybe perform 3 upper extremity training sessions, but likely only 2 that are of high quality. All right, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for our part 2 on speed, agility, quickness, and plyometrics.